Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Tonight we begin with a quiet question about power and time. How does a vast empire, one that has stood for centuries, slowly transform into something entirely new? How can a system that once seemed permanent begin to change, not all at once, but through many pressures building beneath the surface? Our journey this evening takes us into the long and complicated history of the Soviet Union. To understand how it emerged, we must first step into the final years of the Russian Empire, a world that was already shifting in ways many people could sense but few could clearly predict. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you'd like, leave a comment sharing where you're listening from tonight, along with your local time. It's always interesting to see how far these quiet evening journeys travel across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. At the opening of the 20th century, the Russian Empire stood as one of the largest states ever governed by a single monarchy. From the Baltic Sea in the west to the distant Pacific coast in the east, its territory stretched across forests, rivers, plains, deserts, and mountains. 11 time zones separated its farthest regions. This enormous empire contained extraordinary diversity. Russians formed the largest population group, but many other peoples lived under imperial rule as well. Ukrainians, Poles, Lithuanians, Georgians, Armenians, Tatars, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, and dozens of other communities each carried their own languages, traditions, and historical memories. Despite this variety, political authority remained highly centralized. At the center of the system stood the emperor known in Russia as the Tsar. The Romanov dynasty had ruled since 1613, and by the start of the 20th century the throne was held by Tsar Nicholas II. Nicholas had become emperor in 1894. He inherited a structure that placed enormous responsibility on the ruler personally. Laws were issued in the Tsar's name. Ministers answered directly to him. The army swore loyalty to the crown. The imperial bureaucracy managed administration across a territory that was difficult even to imagine in its full scale. For generations, this system had functioned through tradition and loyalty. Yet by the early 1900s, Russia was entering a period of rapid change that challenged the assumptions on which that structure rested. Railways expanded across the empire during the late 19th century. The Trans-Siberian Railway, one of the longest rail systems in the world, connected European Russia with the Pacific coast. Factories appeared in growing industrial districts around cities such as St. Petersburg, Moscow, and the mining regions of the Donbass. Industrial growth created new patterns of life. Workers gathered in large urban neighborhoods close to factories. Many worked long hours in environments that demanded strict discipline. Housing was often crowded. Conditions varied from factory to factory, but the speed of industrialization meant that city life developed faster than many local institutions could adapt. At the same time, the countryside remained home to the majority of the population. Rural villages formed the social backbone of the empire. Peasant families cultivated land through systems that had evolved over centuries. Agricultural work followed seasonal rhythms tied to climate and tradition. This contrast between rapidly expanding cities and traditional rural life created tensions that would gradually become more visible. Urban workers developed shared experiences inside factories and workshops. Peasants continued to rely on village communities and local customs. Political discussion about these changes was limited. Imperial authorities had long been cautious about open political movements. Newspapers were supervised, and large political gatherings were rare. Still, new ideas moved quietly through universities, reading circles, and intellectual communities. Across Europe during this period, discussions about government, economic organization, and social equality were becoming more common. Russian thinkers studied these debates and adapted them to their own circumstances. Some believed the Russian Empire should gradually move toward constitutional government, where laws would be created through representative institutions rather than imperial decree alone. Others explored socialist theories that described societies organized around workers and shared ownership of major industries. These ideas circulated among students, writers, and activists who gathered in discussion groups across cities and university towns. Because open political organizing remained restricted, many of these conversations occurred in small private meetings or in publications that moved discreetly among readers. Different movements began forming during these years. Some groups focused on political reform through legal channels where possible. Others concluded that the existing imperial structure would resist reform indefinitely. For those individuals, change appeared possible only through revolutionary transformation. By the early 20th century, several revolutionary organizations had already taken shape. One group, known as the Socialist Revolutionary Party, focused strongly on peasant concerns and rural political traditions. Another movement, influenced by the writings of Karl Marx, organized around the idea that industrial workers could eventually lead social change. Within this Marxist movement, an organization called the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party began to form networks among workers and intellectuals. Over time, internal disagreements about strategy divided the party into two factions. One faction came to be known as the Bolsheviks, a name that roughly translated to majority. The other group became known as the Mensheviks, meaning minority. The differences between them concerned how revolutionary change should develop and how political organization should operate. These debates would later become important, though at the time they were still confined to relatively small political circles. Meanwhile, everyday life continued across the empire. Markets opened in town squares, river barges carried grain along the Volga, students attended lectures in university halls, soldiers trained in barracks scattered across distant regions. From a distance, the empire appeared stable. The imperial court functioned according to long-established ceremony. Ministries issued administrative orders. Railways connected distant provinces to the capital. Yet beneath this outward order, pressures were quietly building. Industrial workers had begun organizing strikes in several cities during the late 19th century. Peasant communities occasionally protested local land arrangements. Intellectuals wrote essays discussing the future direction of Russian society. These developments did not yet form a single movement. Instead, they existed as separate strands of dissatisfaction and expectation moving through different parts of society. At the same time, international events also began affecting Russia's position in the world. European powers competed for influence across continents. Military alliances and diplomatic rivalries shaped international politics during these years. Russia participated in this system as one of the major imperial powers. Its army was large and its territory extensive. Yet the complexity of governing such a vast state placed constant strain on administration, infrastructure, and political decision-making. Inside the imperial government, officials attempted to manage modernization while maintaining traditional authority. Some supported cautious reforms that might stabilize society. Others believed preserving the established structure remained the safest path. Tsar Nicholas II himself believed strongly in the traditional role of the monarchy. He saw the crown as both a political and moral institution that held the empire together. From his perspective, maintaining the authority of the throne was essential for national stability. Many of his advisors agreed. They worried that rapid political reform might weaken the government's ability to manage such a large and diverse territory. Yet the world surrounding the Russian Empire was already changing. Industrial economies expanded across Europe and North America. New political movements emerged in several countries. Newspapers carried reports about strikes, parliamentary debates, and social reforms occurring beyond Russia's borders. Russian students studying abroad often encountered these developments firsthand. Some returned home with new ideas about political organization and social change. Gradually, the gap between traditional imperial governance and the expectations of certain social groups became more noticeable. Still, change moved slowly. Daily life continued for most people much as it had before. Farmers planted crops in spring and harvested them in autumn. City workers reported to factories each morning. Government offices issued instructions and reports through bureaucratic channels. Yet in quiet discussion rooms, factory districts, and university dormitories, conversations about the future of Russia continued to grow. The early 20th century had opened with an empire that appeared powerful and enduring. But beneath the surface, a wide range of social forces were already beginning to reshape its political landscape. Over the coming years, events would move more quickly than many observers expected. War, economic strain, and political unrest would gradually weaken the structures that had governed the empire for centuries. The story of the Soviet Union begins here not with sudden revolution, but with a vast empire entering a period of transformation whose full consequences were still impossible to see. In the years that followed the opening of the 20th century, the Russian Empire entered a period in which the pressures already present within society began to appear more clearly in public life. Economic change continued to move forward, cities continued to grow, and political debates that had once remained quiet in intellectual circles slowly began reaching a wider audience. At the centre of the empire remained the imperial court in St. Petersburg. From there, ministers managed the administration of a territory that stretched across thousands of miles. Decisions made in the capital affected distant provinces in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and Siberia. Maintaining coordination across such a large system required a complex bureaucracy that had developed gradually over many decades. Yet communication across this vast space could still be slow. Railways helped connect regions, but travel remained lengthy, and information often moved through layers of local administration before reaching central authorities. This created a situation in which the government sometimes responded to developments only after events had already unfolded at the local level. One of the first major shocks to the stability of the empire during this era came from outside its borders. In 1904, Russia entered a conflict with Japan over influence in East Asia, particularly concerning Korea and parts of northeastern China. The war was expected by many in the Russian leadership to be short. Russia possessed a much larger population and a large army. However, the distance between European Russia and the Pacific theatre created logistical challenges. Supplying forces across such enormous distances required long transport routes. Japan, by contrast, fought closer to its own territory and had been modernizing its military structure for several decades. During the conflict, Japanese forces achieved several significant victories. The Russian Pacific Fleet suffered major losses, and Russian ground forces faced serious setbacks. News of these developments spread across the empire and produced surprise among many observers who had expected a different outcome. The war placed additional strain on the Russian economy and the government's reputation. By 1905, public dissatisfaction was becoming increasingly visible in several major cities. In January of that year, a large group of workers in St. Petersburg organized a peaceful march toward the Winter Palace. They hoped to present a petition to the Tsar asking for improved working conditions and political reforms. The march was led by a priest named Georgy Gapon, and included men, women and children carrying religious icons and portraits of the Tsar. The demonstrators believed the emperor might hear their concerns if they approached him respectfully. When the crowd reached areas near the palace, soldiers were stationed to prevent large gatherings near government buildings. Confusion followed as the marchers continued moving forward. Troops eventually opened fire on parts of the crowd. The event shocked the empire. Many people had previously believed the Tsar would act as a protector of ordinary citizens if he were made aware of their difficulties. The violence of that day changed the way many viewed the imperial system. News of the incident travelled quickly through newspapers and word of mouth. Strikes spread through industrial cities, and unrest appeared in several regions. Throughout 1905, workers organised demonstrations in factories and transportation networks. Railway employees staged strikes that interrupted travel and freight movement. Students held meetings discussing political reform. In rural areas, some peasants protested land arrangements and local administration. Facing widespread unrest, the imperial government attempted to restore stability. That autumn, Tsar Nicholas II approved a document known as the October Manifesto. The manifesto promised the creation of a legislative assembly known as the Duma. It also proposed limited civil freedoms, including certain protections for speech and assembly. For many observers, this represented a significant change from the traditional system in which the emperor ruled through decree alone. The first Duma convened in 1906. Representatives from different political groups participated, including reformers who hoped to expand the role of representative government. However, the relationship between the new assembly and the imperial government proved difficult from the beginning. The Tsar retained significant authority, including the power to dissolve the Duma. When disagreements arose between reform-minded deputies and the government, several early assemblies were dismissed after relatively short sessions. This pattern created uncertainty about how far political reform would truly extend. Despite these tensions, the events of 1905 had permanently altered the political atmosphere within the empire. Political parties began operating more openly, newspapers carried debates about policy, and many citizens became more aware of national political questions. At the same time, revolutionary organizations continued their activities. Members of the Socialist Revolutionary Party organized networks among peasants and workers. Marxist groups expanded their presence in urban centers. Among the Bolsheviks, one figure gradually gained prominence as a strategist and organizer: Vladimir Lenin. Lenin had spent many years outside Russia due to political activity that had attracted government attention. While living in exile, he continued writing essays and organizing contacts within the revolutionary movement. His writings focused on the structure of political parties and the role of disciplined organization in achieving political change. Within the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, disagreements between the Bolshevik and Menshevik factions continued. The Mensheviks generally believed Russia needed to pass through a period of democratic development before socialist transformation could occur. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's leadership, argued that a tightly organized revolutionary party could guide events more directly. These discussions remained largely within political circles during the early years after 1905. The imperial government maintained authority, and many people continued their daily routines with limited involvement in political movements. Still, the empire had clearly entered a new stage. Political awareness had spread more widely than before, and the government had acknowledged the need for some form of representation through the Duma. Meanwhile, the international situation continued evolving. European powers formed alliances that gradually divided the continent into rival blocs. Military planning and diplomacy grew increasingly complex as countries prepared for potential conflicts. Russia maintained alliances with France and Britain while watching developments in Central Europe carefully. The balance of power among the great powers remained delicate. Inside Russia, industrial expansion continued during the years leading up to the First World War. New factories opened in several regions, and urban populations continued growing. Workers formed unions and discussion groups to address workplace conditions. Newspapers reported on political debates in the Duma and abroad. Students in universities read political philosophy alongside traditional academic subjects. Yet many structural problems remained unresolved. Land distribution in rural areas remained a source of concern among peasants. Industrial workers often faced demanding conditions. The relationship between the imperial government and reform-minded political groups remained uncertain. By the early 1910s, Russia stood at a crossroads. The empire had survived the upheaval of 1905 and continued functioning as a major European power. At the same time, the changes introduced during that period had opened space for political ideas that would continue shaping events in the years ahead. The next turning point would arrive not through domestic debate alone, but through a conflict that soon spread across much of the world. In the summer of 1914, tensions between European powers escalated rapidly following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. Alliances activated, mobilizations began, and within weeks a regional crisis expanded into a global war. Russia entered the conflict on the side of its allies, committing its army to what would become the First World War. The war would transform conditions within the Russian Empire in ways that few had anticipated. When the First World War began in the summer of 1914, the Russian Empire entered the conflict with a sense of duty to its alliances and a belief that national unity would strengthen the country during wartime. Mobilization orders were issued quickly. Across cities, towns, and villages, men reported to recruitment centers and prepared to join the army. The scale of mobilization was immense. Russia possessed one of the largest armies in the world, and millions of soldiers were called into service during the early months of the war. Railway stations filled with departing units while families gathered to say quiet farewells. At first, the war produced a temporary feeling of shared purpose across much of society. Political parties in the Duma announced support for the war effort, and newspapers reported on early campaigns along the empire's western frontiers. Russian forces moved toward East Prussia and the regions bordering the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The opening operations were ambitious, but the coordination of such large armies across wide distances presented serious difficulties. Communication between units was often slow, and supply systems struggled to keep pace with the movements of troops. Within months, Russian armies suffered major defeats in several engagements. The battles of Tannenberg and the Masurian Lakes in 1914 resulted in heavy losses and forced Russian forces to withdraw from parts of East Prussia. Although the Russian army remained large, the early setbacks revealed structural weaknesses. Equipment shortages appeared in some units, and transport networks faced increasing pressure as supplies moved across long distances toward the front. The war soon developed into a prolonged struggle along a broad front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathian Mountains. Soldiers endured difficult conditions in trenches and defensive positions. Seasonal weather changes created additional challenges, especially during the long winters. While the army faced difficulties at the front, the effects of war also began reaching cities and villages across the empire. Factories shifted toward military production, working to supply weapons, uniforms, and ammunition. Railways carried soldiers and equipment, often leaving less capacity for civilian transportation. Prices for food and basic goods began rising as the war placed pressure on agriculture and distribution. Families whose members had been drafted adjusted to new responsibilities at home. Women increasingly entered industrial workplaces to replace men serving in the army. Rural communities worked to maintain agricultural production despite the absence of many labourers. As the war continued through 1915 and 1916, the strain on the empire's economic and administrative systems grew more visible. Military setbacks continued. German and Austro-Hungarian forces launched large offensives that pushed Russian armies eastward in several regions. Retreats required the evacuation of towns and rail facilities, adding to the logistical complexity of the conflict. Meanwhile, the imperial government struggled to coordinate wartime production and transportation effectively. Ministers changed frequently, and disagreements within the administration slowed decision-making. Public confidence in the government gradually declined as shortages became more common in urban areas. Bread lines formed in major cities where deliveries of grain and flour arrived irregularly due to transportation difficulties. Political debates inside the Duma grew more intense. Some deputies argued that stronger coordination between government officials and representatives of industry and labour was necessary to maintain the war effort. Others criticised the administration's inability to manage the crisis efficiently. At the centre of this increasingly complicated situation stood Tsar Nicholas II. In 1915, the Tsar made a decision that would place him more directly at the centre of military affairs. He chose to assume personal command of the Russian army. This meant leaving the capital and travelling to military headquarters near the front. The decision carried symbolic meaning. By taking command, Nicholas intended to demonstrate personal commitment to the war effort. However, it also meant that responsibility for military outcomes would now be associated more directly with the emperor himself. While the Tsar remained at military headquarters, domestic administration in the capital continued under the supervision of government ministers and members of the imperial household. Among those who gained influence during this period was Grigory Rasputin, a religious figure who had developed connections within the imperial family. Rasputin's presence in political discussions became a subject of widespread rumour and controversy in St. Petersburg society. Many members of the political establishment viewed his influence with concern. Stories circulated in newspapers and private conversations, contributing to an atmosphere of uncertainty surrounding the government. By late 1916, the combination of military losses, economic disruption, and political tension had created an increasingly fragile situation. Winter conditions intensified the difficulties of transportation and supply. Food deliveries to cities became less predictable. Workers in several industrial centres began organising strikes over wages and living conditions. In February 1917, demonstrations began appearing in the capital, which by then had been renamed Petrograd. The protests initially focused on bread shortages and working conditions. Crowds gathered in the streets, and workers from large factories joined the demonstrations. Over several days, the number of participants increased significantly. Public transportation stopped as workers left their jobs to join the gatherings. Local authorities attempted to restore order, but the scale of the demonstrations made control difficult. Soldiers stationed in the city were instructed to maintain security. In several cases, however, units hesitated to confront large crowds of civilians. Some soldiers eventually joined the demonstrators rather than dispersing them. As the protests expanded, political leaders inside the Duma began meeting to discuss how to stabilize the situation. Many concluded that the existing government had lost the ability to manage the crisis. Meanwhile, Tsar Nicholas II remained away from Petrograd at military headquarters. Communication between the capital and the emperor became increasingly urgent as events unfolded rapidly. By early March 1917, several key political and military figures advised the Tsar that maintaining the current system might no longer be possible. After consultations with advisors and commanders, Nicholas II made the decision to abdicate the throne. His abdication ended more than 3 centuries of Romanov rule. The imperial system that had governed the Russian Empire for generations had come to an abrupt conclusion. In the days that followed, a new authority known as the Provisional Government took responsibility for national administration. Its members were drawn from political groups that had previously participated in the Duma. Their immediate task was to restore order, continue the war effort alongside Russia's allies, and prepare for the creation of a more representative political system. At the same time, another body began emerging alongside the provisional government. Workers and soldiers in Petrograd formed councils known as Soviets. These assemblies represented groups of workers, soldiers, and local communities who wished to participate directly in political decisions. The existence of both the provisional government and the Soviets created a situation in which authority was shared between 2 different centres of power. This arrangement would become known as a period of dual power. Across the country, people watched closely as these new institutions began shaping the next phase of Russian history. For revolutionary groups that had spent years organising quietly, the collapse of imperial rule opened a new and uncertain opportunity. Among those observing these developments from abroad was Vladimir Lenin. In exile in Switzerland, Lenin followed reports from Russia with intense interest. He understood that the sudden fall of the monarchy had created a rare moment in which political structures were rapidly changing. Soon arrangements would be made for his return to Russia. That journey would soon place him directly inside the unfolding events that would determine the future of the country. The collapse of the Romanov monarchy in March 1917 created a political landscape unlike anything Russia had experienced before. Authority that had once been concentrated in the imperial court now passed into new institutions that were still defining their responsibilities and their relationship to the public. The provisional government assumed formal control of state administration. Its members were largely drawn from moderate political parties that had previously participated in the Duma. Many believed the moment had arrived to guide Russia toward a constitutional and representative political system, similar to those developing elsewhere in Europe. At the same time, another set of institutions continued growing in influence. Workers, soldiers, and citizens in Petrograd had organized councils known as Soviets. These assemblies represented local groups and often held strong influence among factory workers and military units stationed in the capital. The existence of both the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet produced an unusual arrangement. Each body claimed legitimacy in different ways. The provisional government held formal administrative authority and international recognition, while the Soviets held considerable influence among the population that had participated directly in the revolution. In practice, decisions often required cooperation between the two. During the early weeks after the monarchy's fall, the provisional government issued several reforms intended to signal a new political direction. Restrictions on speech and assembly were relaxed. Political prisoners were released from jails and places of exile. Newspapers began publishing a wide range of viewpoints. These changes created an atmosphere of openness that had rarely existed in the empire before. Political parties that had once operated quietly now organized meetings in public halls and city squares. Workers gathered in factory committees to discuss workplace conditions and political questions. Soldiers in barracks debated the future of the war and their role in national affairs. Yet even as this new political energy spread through society, several difficult questions remained unresolved. The most urgent concerned the war. Russia was still engaged in the First World War alongside Britain and France. The provisional government believed that honouring these alliances was necessary to maintain Russia's position among the major powers. Ministers therefore decided to continue participation in the war. For many soldiers and civilians, however, the war had already imposed years of hardship. Millions had served at the front, and many families had lost relatives during the long campaigns. Food shortages and economic strain had become common in urban areas. These conditions created disagreement about whether Russia should remain in the conflict. Another unresolved issue concerned land ownership. In rural regions, peasants had long hoped for reforms that would redistribute large estates among village communities. The provisional government preferred to postpone major decisions on land until a national assembly could meet to write a new constitution. This delay frustrated many peasants, who believed the revolution had already created an opportunity for change. While these debates continued across Russia, news arrived in April 1917 that a well-known revolutionary figure was returning to Petrograd after years in exile. Vladimir Lenin travelled across Europe in a sealed railway carriage arranged with the assistance of German authorities. Germany, which was at war with Russia, expected that revolutionary activity inside Russia might weaken its opponent. When Lenin arrived at Finland Station in Petrograd, he was greeted by supporters and curious observers. His return quickly became a topic of discussion among political activists. Within days, Lenin presented a set of proposals that later became known as the April Theses. In these statements, he argued that the revolution had entered a new stage. According to Lenin, the provisional government represented interests that would prevent deeper social transformation. He called for power to pass to the Soviets, which he believed represented workers and soldiers more directly. He also proposed that Russia withdraw from the war and begin redistributing land to peasant communities. These positions differed sharply from the policies of the provisional government, and even from some other socialist groups who believed the country first needed a period of democratic development before more radical changes. Inside the Bolshevik party itself, Lenin's proposals generated debate. Some members initially believed his ideas moved too quickly given the uncertain situation. Over time, however, Lenin's arguments began gaining support among workers and soldiers who had grown increasingly frustrated with the continuation of the war and the slow pace of reform. Throughout the spring and summer of 1917, Russia experienced a period of intense political activity. Newspapers printed competing programs for the country's future. Public meetings filled theatres and factories. Political speeches became common in urban districts. The provisional government attempted to stabilise the situation by continuing administrative reforms and organizing preparations for elections to a constituent assembly that would draft a permanent constitution. Yet, maintaining stability proved difficult. In June 1917, Russian military leaders launched a major offensive against Austro-Hungarian forces along the front. The operation was intended to demonstrate that the Russian army remained capable of coordinated action. Initially, the offensive achieved limited success. Soon afterward, however, German and Austro-Hungarian counterattacks forced Russian units into retreat. Morale within the army declined further, and desertions increased in several sectors. Back in Petrograd, dissatisfaction grew among soldiers and workers who believed the government had failed to address their concerns about the war and economic conditions. In July, demonstrations erupted in the capital involving soldiers, sailors, and industrial workers. Some participants called for the transfer of power to the Soviets. The situation became tense as crowds gathered near government buildings. Although the demonstrations did not develop into a coordinated revolution, they revealed the growing instability within the political system. Following the unrest, the provisional government moved against several Bolshevik leaders. Lenin went into hiding for a period, leaving Petrograd to avoid arrest. During the late summer, another unexpected development further complicated the political situation. General Lava Kornilov, a senior military commander, attempted to move troops toward Petrograd in what appeared to be an effort to restore order through stronger military authority. Many political leaders feared this movement could lead to a military takeover. In response, the provisional government called on various political groups, including the Bolsheviks, to help organize resistance against Kornilov's forces. Railway workers and soldiers disrupted troop movements, preventing the attempt from reaching Petrograd. Although the crisis ended without major violence, it significantly weakened confidence in the provisional government. Many citizens concluded that the administration lacked the authority needed to maintain stability. At the same time, the Bolsheviks gained increasing support among workers and soldiers in major cities. By early autumn of 1917, the Bolshevik Party had secured majorities in several key Soviets, including those in Petrograd and Moscow. Within these councils, discussions increasingly focused on whether power should pass fully into the hands of the Soviets. Lenin, still operating cautiously due to the earlier charges against him, began urging Bolshevik leaders to prepare for decisive action. He argued that the moment had arrived when the provisional government had lost public confidence and the Soviets could assume leadership of the country. Within the Bolshevik leadership, discussions took place about timing and strategy. Some members believed the situation required further preparation. Others agreed with Lenin that delay might allow opposing forces to reorganize. As October approached, these debates continued behind closed doors while daily life in Petrograd moved forward under a growing sense of uncertainty. Factories continued operating, though strikes occurred in some sectors. Soldiers stationed in the city attended meetings discussing political developments. Newspapers carried reports about debates within the government and the Soviets. Most residents of the capital could sense that another turning point was approaching. By the autumn of 1917, the political balance inside Russia had shifted steadily. The provisional government continued to function formally as the country's administration, yet its authority had become increasingly uncertain. Many of the promises made earlier in the year, especially those concerning land reform, economic stability, and the war, remained unresolved. Meanwhile, the Soviets had grown into influential political bodies in several major cities. Workers, soldiers, and local activists used these councils to debate policies and coordinate activity across factories and military units. Their meetings were often crowded and energetic, reflecting the heightened political awareness spreading through society. Within the Petrograd Soviet, the Bolshevik Party had gradually gained a strong position. By September 1917, Bolshevik representatives held a majority of seats in the council. This shift reflected growing support among factory workers and soldiers who had become frustrated with the direction of the provisional government. During this period, Vladimir Lenin remained outside Petrograd for safety, but he continued communicating with Bolshevik leaders in the city. From his temporary locations, he he wrote a series of letters urging the party to prepare for a decisive transfer of power. Lenin believed the political moment was temporary. If the Bolsheviks waited too long, he warned, other political forces might regain control and prevent the Soviets from assuming authority. Inside Petrograd, Bolshevik leaders such as Leon Trotsky worked to organize support within the Soviets and among military units stationed in the capital. Trotsky had recently joined the Bolsheviks and quickly became one of the most visible figures within the Petrograd Soviet. In October, the Soviet established a body called the Military Revolutionary Committee. Officially, the committee's purpose was to coordinate defense of the capital in case of threats from outside forces. In practice, it became an instrument through which Bolshevik leaders could organize soldiers and guards loyal to the Soviets. At the same time, the provisional government continued operating from the Winter Palace in Petrograd. Prime Minister Alexander Kerensky attempted to maintain order and prepare for the upcoming elections to the Constituent Assembly, which had been scheduled for later that year. Kerensky believed the assembly would provide a democratic foundation for Russia's future government. Yet by October, political tensions had already reached a point where patience for gradual constitutional solutions had diminished among several factions. During the final days of October, according to the Russian calendar used at the time, the Military Revolutionary Committee began placing loyal units at key positions throughout Petrograd. Soldiers sympathetic to the Soviets quietly took control of bridges, railway stations, telegraph offices, and government buildings. These actions were carried out with careful coordination and little public disruption. For many residents of the city, daily routines continued almost normally as these developments unfolded. Streetcars ran along their routes, shops opened during the morning hours, meetings continued inside factories and military barracks. By the evening of October 24, Bolshevik forces had secured many strategic points across the capital. The provisional government remained inside the Winter Palace, protected by a small group of military cadets and volunteer defenders. The following day, representatives of the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets began arriving in Petrograd. Delegates from across the country gathered to discuss the future political structure of Russia. As the Congress prepared to open, the Military Revolutionary Committee moved to complete the transfer of power. Units loyal to the Soviets surrounded the Winter Palace. Artillery from the cruiser Aurora, stationed in the nearby Neva River, fired a blank signal shot that served as a coordinated signal for the operation. Later that evening, Red Guards and soldiers entered the palace and arrested members of the provisional government who remained inside. The transition occurred with relatively limited fighting compared with many later revolutions in other countries. By the early hours of October 26, the provisional government had ceased functioning. When the Congress of Soviets convened, Bolshevik representatives announced that authority had passed to the Soviets. Several socialist groups objected to the procedure and left the Congress in protest. Those who remained approved the creation of a new governing body. This government became known as the Council of People's Commissars. Vladimir Lenin was appointed its chairman, placing him at the head of the new administration. Among the first decrees issued by the new government were proposals addressing two of the most urgent concerns within Russian society. One decree called for negotiations to end Russia's participation in the First World War. Another declared that land owned by large estates should be redistributed among peasant communities. These announcements were designed to address the expectations of soldiers and peasants who had supported revolutionary change. In the weeks following the October Revolution, the Bolshevik government worked to extend its authority beyond Petrograd and Moscow into the wider territory of the former empire. In some regions, local Soviets accepted the new government quickly. In others, political groups opposed to Bolshevik rule began organizing resistance. Several parties that had previously cooperated with the provisional government viewed the Bolshevik takeover as illegitimate. Some military officers also opposed the transfer of power. As these disagreements spread across the country, Russia gradually entered a new phase of conflict. The Bolshevik leadership believed that defending the revolution required building new institutions of authority. One of the first steps involved reorganizing security and military forces. A new organization known as the Red Army began forming under the leadership of Leon Trotsky. The army was designed to defend the revolutionary government against internal and external opponents. At the same time, another organization called the Cheka was created to investigate and prevent counter-revolutionary activity. Its role would become significant during the years of conflict that followed. Across Russia, the collapse of imperial authority and the rapid transfer of power created a complex situation. Some regions accepted Bolshevik leadership and began implementing new policies concerning land and industry. Elsewhere, political and military groups opposed to Bolshevik rule formed armed forces known collectively as the White Armies. These groups included former imperial officers, political conservatives, and others who rejected the new government. By early 1918, it had become clear that the struggle over Russia's future would not be resolved quickly. The Bolsheviks now controlled the central government in Petrograd, but large parts of the country remained contested. Different armies and political movements operated across vast territories. Meanwhile, negotiations with Germany began regarding Russia's withdrawal from the war. These talks eventually produced the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. Under the treaty, Russia agreed to leave the First World War but also ceded large territories in Eastern Europe to German influence. The agreement ended Russia's participation in the global conflict, yet it also intensified domestic opposition to the Bolsheviks among groups that believed the terms were too severe. As these developments unfolded, the Russian Revolution entered a new and far more turbulent stage. The Bolshevik government now faced the enormous challenge of defending its authority while attempting to build an entirely new political system. Over the next several years, this effort would unfold during one of the most complex civil conflicts of the 20th century. By the spring of 1918, the new Bolshevik government had established its headquarters in Moscow. The decision to move the capital from Petrograd reflected both practical and symbolic considerations. Moscow lay deeper inside the country, farther from the front lines of the First World War and the unstable western borders. The city also carried long historical associations with earlier periods of Russian statehood. From offices inside the Kremlin, Lenin and the Council of People's Commissars began directing the government of a country that was rapidly entering civil war. The political landscape across the former Russian Empire had become fragmented. Some regions recognized Bolshevik authority and established local Soviet administrations aligned with the new government. Other territories rejected the revolutionary leadership and organized resistance under a variety of political banners. These opposing forces collectively became known as the White Movement. Unlike the Bolsheviks, the White forces did not represent a single unified political program. Their ranks included former imperial officers, monarchists, supporters of parliamentary government, regional leaders, and groups that opposed Bolshevik policies for different reasons. Because their goals varied, coordination among the White Armies often proved difficult. Nevertheless, they shared a determination to prevent the Bolsheviks from consolidating power across the country. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks began organizing their own military force with increasing urgency. Leon Trotsky, who had taken responsibility for military organization, faced the task of creating a disciplined army from the diverse revolutionary groups that had supported the October uprising. Workers' militias, soldiers from former imperial units, and volunteers from rural communities were gradually brought together into a new structure known as the Red Army. Trotsky travelled frequently by armoured train between various fronts of the conflict, working to coordinate commanders and reinforce discipline within the army. His efforts focused on transforming loosely organised revolutionary fighters into a more structured military force capable of defending the government. At the same time, the Bolshevik leadership implemented policies designed to support the war effort and maintain control over resources. Industry, transportation, and major banks were brought under state administration. Grain requisitioning policies were introduced in rural areas to ensure that cities and military units could receive food supplies during the conflict. These measures, later known collectively as war communism, reflected the extreme circumstances of the Civil War period. The government aimed to direct resources centrally in order to sustain both the army and the urban population. However, these policies also created tensions between the government and sections of the rural population. Peasant communities that had welcomed the redistribution of land after the revolution sometimes resisted grain requisitioning when it reduced the food available for local consumption. Across Russia, the civil war expanded into multiple theatres. In the south, white forces organized under commanders such as General Anton Denikin and later General Pyotr Wrangel. These armies advanced northward from regions near the Black Sea. In Siberia, another white government emerged under Admiral Alexander Kolchak, who established control over large sections of the eastern territories and declared himself supreme ruler of Russia. Farther north, foreign military units from several Allied countries arrived in ports such as Arkhangelsk and Murmansk. Their presence reflected the complicated international context surrounding the Russian Civil War. Some foreign governments hoped to reopen an eastern front against Germany, or to support anti-Bolshevik forces attempting to re-establish a different government. The presence of foreign troops added another layer of complexity to the conflict. Although their numbers were relatively limited compared with Russian armies, their involvement reinforced the perception among Bolshevik leaders that the revolution faced threats both inside and outside the country. During these years, railways became one of the most important strategic resources. Control of rail lines allowed armies to move soldiers and supplies across enormous distances. Both Red and White forces attempted to secure key railway junctions in order to maintain logistical advantages. Cities changed hands multiple times as armies advanced and retreated. Communication between distant regions often became unreliable, and local authorities sometimes operated independently when central instructions could not reach them quickly. The Civil War also had profound effects on everyday life for ordinary people. Industrial production declined significantly in several regions due to disruptions in supply chains and the movement of workers into military service. Transportation difficulties affected the distribution of food and fuel. Many families moved between cities and rural areas seeking more stable living conditions. Despite these hardships, the Bolshevik government gradually strengthened its administrative structures. The Communist Party, formerly known as the Bolshevik Party, expanded its membership and established committees across cities, factories, and military units. Party members played important roles in organizing local administrations and implementing national policies. The Cheka, created shortly after the revolution, continued operating as a security organization responsible for investigating counter-revolutionary activity. Its authority expanded during the Civil War years as the government attempted to suppress armed opposition and maintain internal stability. While the conflict continued, the Bolshevik leadership also began considering how a new political system might function once the fighting ended. In 1918, a new constitution for the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic was adopted. It defined the structure of government based on Soviet councils representing workers, soldiers, and peasants. Voting rights were extended broadly among working populations, though individuals associated with former ruling classes or counter-revolutionary organizations were excluded from participation in certain circumstances. The Constitution described a system in which political power flowed upward, from local Soviets to regional bodies and ultimately to national institutions. In practice, the Communist Party increasingly played a central role in guiding political decisions within this structure. Meanwhile, the military situation began shifting gradually in favor of the Red Army. Although the White forces initially captured large territories, their lack of unified leadership and competing political visions made long-term coordination difficult. Communication between distant white commanders proved challenging across the vast geography of Russia. The Red Army, by contrast, benefited from controlling central regions with dense railway networks connecting Moscow to several fronts. This allowed Trotsky and other commanders to move troops quickly where they were needed. By late 1919 and into 1920, several major white offensives were defeated. Kolchak's forces in Siberia collapsed under pressure from Red Army advances. In the south, Denikin's troops were pushed back toward the Black Sea. As these campaigns concluded, the Bolshevik government gradually regained control over much of the territory that had once belonged to the Russian Empire. However, the end of major military operations did not immediately restore stability. The Civil War had left deep economic disruption across the country. Industrial production had fallen sharply, transportation networks required repair, and agricultural output had been affected by years of conflict. Millions of people had experienced displacement, loss of property, or the absence of family members who had served in various armies. By the early 1920s, the Bolshevik leadership faced a new challenge: transforming a revolutionary government created during war into a functioning state capable of rebuilding the economy and administering a vast country in peacetime. By the beginning of the 1920s, the Civil War had largely concluded, and the Bolshevik leadership faced a new set of responsibilities that differed from those of wartime. The Red Army had secured control over most of the territories that had once belonged to the Russian Empire, and the major white armies had either been defeated or forced into exile. Yet the victory had come at a heavy cost. Years of war had left the country economically weakened. Industrial production had fallen far below the levels seen before the First World War. Railways required repair after years of intense military use. Cities faced shortages of fuel and food, while rural communities had experienced disruption from grain requisitioning policies and military campaigns. The leadership in Moscow understood that continuing the strict wartime policies of war communism would be difficult under peacetime conditions. While those measures had allowed the government to supply the Red Army and maintain basic administration during the conflict, they had also produced tensions with sections of the population, particularly among peasants who had resisted compulsory grain collection. In 1921, the government introduced a significant adjustment to economic policy, known as the New Economic Policy, often abbreviated as the NEP. Under the NEP, the state retained control over major industries such as heavy manufacturing, banking, and large-scale transportation. However, smaller businesses and local markets were allowed to operate with greater freedom. Farmers were permitted to sell surplus produce after paying a tax in grain to the government. This policy aimed to stimulate agricultural production and revive local commerce while maintaining the broader socialist framework that the Bolshevik leadership intended to build over time. Markets gradually returned to many towns. Small shops reopened, traders carried goods between villages and cities, and farmers brought grain and produce to market squares once again. The NEP represented a practical response to economic realities. It allowed the country to stabilize after years of conflict, while the government continued developing long-term plans for socialist transformation. During this same period, political institutions also began taking more permanent form. The Communist Party remained at the center of political life. Party congresses met regularly to discuss national policy, and committees operated at regional and local levels across the country. Membership in the party grew steadily as new administrators, workers, and activists joined its ranks. Government administration was organized through Soviets at various levels, local councils, regional bodies, and national institutions. These structures formed the formal framework of governance within the revolutionary state. In 1922, another important development occurred in the organization of the country. Several territories that had once been part of the former empire, including Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian region, joined together in a new federal structure. This political union became known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the Soviet Union. The creation of the Union reflected the leadership's attempt to manage the immense geographic diversity of the former empire, while maintaining a shared political system. Each republic had its own administrative institutions, but major decisions regarding defense, foreign policy, and economic planning were coordinated through central authorities in Moscow. The new union thus combined federal structures with strong centralized leadership. While these institutional arrangements developed, the leadership of the Communist Party itself began experiencing internal discussions about the future direction of the state. Vladimir Lenin remained the most influential figure within the government. His role in leading the October Revolution and guiding the Bolshevik movement had established him as the central authority within the party. However, by the early 1920s, Lenin's health began to decline. After suffering a series of strokes beginning in 1922, he gradually reduced his participation in day-to-day political activity. As Lenin's involvement diminished, other prominent figures within the party assumed greater responsibility in administration and policy debates. Among these figures were Leon Trotsky, who had played a central role in organizing the Red Army during the Civil War, Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, who had been long-time associates of Lenin, and Joseph Stalin, who had been appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922. The position of General Secretary initially appeared administrative, involving the coordination of party appointments and organizational matters. Yet the role also allowed Stalin to develop extensive connections across the party's growing network of local and regional committees. During these years, discussions among party leaders addressed many questions about the future development of the Soviet state. Some leaders believed that rapid industrial expansion should begin soon in order to strengthen the country's economy and military capabilities. Others argued that economic recovery under the NEP should continue for a longer period before major structural changes were introduced. There were also debates about the role of the Communist Party itself within the broader political system. While the party already held significant influence, discussions continued about how centralized decision-making should be balanced with participation from local Soviets and economic institutions. These debates occurred primarily within party congresses and committee meetings rather than through open public political competition. By 1924, the Soviet Union had begun stabilizing after the upheavals of revolution and civil war. Agricultural production was gradually recovering under the NEP, trade networks were reappearing, and urban life was slowly becoming more predictable. That same year marked an important moment in the history of the new state. In January 1924, Vladimir Lenin died after a prolonged period of illness. His death created a significant turning point within the Communist Party. Lenin had served as the central figure whose authority had helped guide decisions during the revolutionary years. Without him, the leadership structure became less clearly defined. A group of prominent leaders continued governing collectively, while discussions about future policy directions intensified. Joseph Stalin, in his role as General Secretary, oversaw the administrative operations of the party apparatus. Leon Trotsky remained a respected revolutionary figure associated with the Red Army and the intellectual foundations of the movement. Other leaders such as Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Nikolai Bukharin also held influential positions within party institutions. During the years following Lenin's death, these figures engaged in ongoing debates about economic policy, international strategy, and the organization of the Communist Party itself. While these discussions unfolded within party congresses and committee meetings, the broader Soviet population focused largely on rebuilding daily life after years of disruption. Factories resumed production with greater regularity, schools reopened in many communities, transportation networks were repaired and expanded. New cultural institutions also began appearing across the Soviet Union. The government encouraged literacy campaigns, public education, and the creation of theatres, libraries and workers' clubs designed to promote cultural participation among citizens. Artists, writers and filmmakers experimented with new forms of expression that reflected the social transformations of the revolutionary era. By the middle of the 1920s, the Soviet Union had entered a period of cautious recovery. Yet beneath this surface stability, the question of leadership within the Communist Party remained unresolved. After Lenin's death in 1924, the Soviet Union entered a period in which leadership within the Communist Party gradually shifted through a series of internal debates and organizational changes. The country itself was stabilizing after the years of revolution and civil war, yet the direction of its future development remained open to discussion among the party's leading figures. At the center of these discussions were several individuals who had played important roles during the revolutionary period. Leon Trotsky remained widely known for his leadership in organizing the Red Army during the Civil War. Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev had long-standing connections with Lenin and held significant influence in the party's political structures. Nikolai Bukharin had gained recognition as a theorist who supported the continuation of the new economic policy. Joseph Stalin, serving as General Secretary, occupied a different kind of position. His responsibilities focused on the internal administration of the Communist Party. This role involved supervising the appointment of party officials, coordinating communications between regional committees, and maintaining records of membership and organization. Although the position initially appeared technical rather than political, it gradually allowed Stalin to build a wide network of relationships across the party's expanding structure. As the Soviet Union grew larger and more complex, the party apparatus became increasingly important in managing local and regional administration. During the mid-1920s, discussions among party leaders focused on several major issues. One concerned the pace of economic development. The new economic policy had restored a degree of stability after the Civil War by allowing limited private trade and market activity. Agricultural production had increased, and urban markets once again carried food and consumer goods. Some leaders believed the NEP should continue for an extended period in order to strengthen the country's economic base gradually. Others argued that faster industrial development would eventually be necessary if the Soviet Union wished to compete with industrialized countries in Europe and North America. Another topic concerned the international situation. Communist movements had appeared in several countries after the First World War, but most had not succeeded in establishing governments similar to the one in Russia. This raised questions about whether the Soviet Union should expect immediate support from revolutions abroad or concentrate primarily on building socialism within its own borders. These discussions did not take place through public electoral campaigns. Instead, they occurred within meetings of the Communist Party, particularly during party congresses and gatherings of the Central Committee. Over time, alliances formed among various leaders as they debated these questions. In the early years after Lenin's death, Stalin cooperated politically with Zinoviev and Kamenev. Together, they criticized Trotsky's positions on several issues and gradually reduced his influence within the leadership. Trotsky continued participating in party discussions, but by the mid-1920s, his role in central decision-making had diminished. Eventually, he was removed from several key positions and later expelled from the Communist Party. Meanwhile, the political alignments within the leadership continued evolving. Stalin later formed a working relationship with Nikolai Bukharin, who supported the continuation of the new economic policy and gradual economic development. Through these shifting alliances, Stalin's influence within the party organization continued growing. Because the General Secretary supervised appointments to many administrative positions, individuals who advanced within the party structure often developed professional connections with his office. At the same time, the Soviet Union itself was undergoing cultural and social transformation. The government invested heavily in education and literacy campaigns. Large numbers of adults who had grown up without formal schooling were encouraged to attend evening classes and reading programs. Newspapers and publications expanded their circulation as literacy rates gradually improved. Universities and technical institutes trained engineers, teachers, doctors, and administrators who would be needed to operate the modern institutions the Soviet leadership hoped to build. Cities also experienced noticeable change during these years. Electric power networks expanded, public transportation systems improved, and new housing projects appeared in industrial districts. Cultural life developed through theatres, film studios, and publishing houses that experimented with artistic forms reflecting the new political environment. The Soviet film industry, for example, became internationally recognized for its innovative editing techniques and storytelling methods. Directors explored ways to present historical events and social themes through visual narrative. Meanwhile, agricultural communities continued operating under the framework established by the NEP. Peasant families cultivated land that had been redistributed after the revolution, selling part of their harvest in local markets once they had fulfilled tax obligations to the state. Although the countryside remained economically modest, many villages had regained a degree of stability compared with the Civil War period. By the late 1920s, however, the leadership of the Communist Party began reconsidering whether the existing economic structure would be sufficient for the country's long-term development. Industrial production had improved since the early 1920s, yet it still lagged behind the levels seen in more industrialized nations. Many party leaders believed that the Soviet Union would eventually need a stronger industrial base in order to ensure economic independence and national security. These discussions increasingly emphasized the importance of large-scale planning in the economy. Around this time, Stalin's position within the party had become firmly established. His influence over the administrative network of party organizations allowed him to guide discussions within the Central Committee and shape the direction of policy debates. By the end of the decade, several of his earlier political allies had also lost influence within the leadership. Zinoviev and Kamenev, who had once cooperated with Stalin, were removed from key roles after disagreements over policy and party organization. Through this gradual process, Stalin emerged as the dominant figure in the party's leadership structure. At the same time, new economic plans began taking shape. Party leaders concluded that the Soviet Union would embark on a period of rapid industrial development guided by national economic planning. The goal was to expand heavy industry, increase production of machinery, and strengthen the country's technological capabilities. These plans would soon be organized into a series of programs known as five-year plans. The shift marked the beginning of a new stage in Soviet history, one that would bring dramatic changes to industry, agriculture, and everyday life across the country. The policies introduced during the next decade would transform the Soviet Union from a society recovering from revolution into a state pursuing rapid industrial modernization on a vast scale. Toward the end of the 1920s, the leadership of the Soviet Union began implementing a major transformation of the national economy. The earlier years of recovery under the new economic policy had restored a degree of stability, yet many party leaders believed the country still faced a long period of economic development before it could match the industrial capacity of other major powers. In response to this concern, the government introduced a system of centralized economic planning designed to guide industrial growth on a national scale. The first of these programs became known as the First Five-Year Plan, launched in 1928. The central idea behind the plan was that the state would coordinate production targets for major sectors of the economy. Instead of relying primarily on market forces, economic activity would be directed through national planning agencies that determined priorities for investment and development. One of the most important goals of the plan was the expansion of heavy industry. Factories producing steel, coal, machinery, and electrical equipment were considered essential for building a modern industrial economy. Large construction projects began appearing across several regions of the Soviet Union. New industrial cities emerged around major factories and mining complexes. One well-known example was Magnitogorsk, located near large iron ore deposits in the Ural Mountains. The city grew rapidly as workers arrived from many parts of the country to participate in the construction of steel plants and supporting infrastructure. Railways were expanded to connect industrial centres with sources of raw materials. Power stations were built to provide electricity for factories and urban districts. Engineers and technicians worked to design machines capable of operating in large-scale production environments. The government encouraged young workers and students to participate in these projects. Newspapers and public meetings often highlighted the importance of industrial development for the country's future independence and strength. While industry expanded quickly during these years, another major transformation was taking place in agriculture. Under the earlier new economic policy, peasants had cultivated land largely through individual family farms. Agricultural produce could be sold in local markets after taxes were paid to the state. However, many leaders within the Communist Party believed that agriculture needed to be reorganized in order to support the country's growing urban population and expanding industrial workforce. The government therefore introduced a policy known as collectivization. Collectivization involved combining individual farms into larger cooperative agricultural units called collective farms, or kolkhozes. In these farms, land, equipment, and livestock were managed collectively rather than by individual families. Another type of agricultural unit, known as the state farm or sovkhoz, was operated directly by government authorities and employed agricultural workers as state employees. The goal of collectivization was to increase agricultural productivity through larger-scale farming methods and improved coordination between rural production and national economic planning. In practice, the process unfolded unevenly across different regions. In some villages, collective farms formed gradually through local agreements among peasants who believed cooperation might improve efficiency. In other areas, the transition occurred more quickly under pressure from government campaigns encouraging collectivization. These campaigns also included efforts to modernize agricultural techniques. Tractors and other machinery were introduced through machine tractor stations that served groups of collective farms. Agricultural specialists trained farmers in new cultivation methods designed to increase yields. The transition to collective farming changed daily life in many rural communities. Instead of working individual plots independently, villagers participated in shared agricultural schedules organized by the collective farm administration. Schools, cultural centers, and medical facilities gradually appeared in some rural areas as part of broader efforts to modernize village life. At the same time, the rapid pace of change created tensions in certain regions. Adjusting long-standing farming practices to the new collective structure required time, and not all communities adopted the system easily. Despite these challenges, collectivization continued expanding through the early 1930s as the government worked to integrate agriculture into the broader national economic plan. Meanwhile, industrial development accelerated. Large construction projects transformed landscapes across the Soviet Union. Hydroelectric dams were built along major rivers to generate power for factories and cities. Mining operations expanded in regions rich with coal, iron, and other minerals. Rail lines connected these industrial centres to ports and urban markets. Factories produced tractors, locomotives, and electrical equipment that supported both industry and agriculture. The government encouraged workers to improve productivity through campaigns that emphasized technical skill and dedication to national development. Educational institutions also expanded during this period. Technical schools trained engineers and industrial specialists who would operate new machinery and manage factory operations. Universities developed programs focused on science, engineering, and industrial management. The cultural atmosphere of the early 1930s reflected this focus on modernization. Posters, films, and literature often portrayed industrial workers, engineers, and farmers participating in the building of a new society based on modern technology and collective effort. Cities changed rapidly as well. New housing districts appeared near factories to accommodate expanding workforces. Public transportation systems expanded to connect residential areas with industrial zones. Urban populations increased, as many rural residents moved to cities in search of employment in the growing industrial sector. The results of the first 5-year plan were mixed but significant. Industrial output increased substantially in several key sectors, particularly in steel, coal, and machinery production. These industries formed the foundation for further economic development in later years. However, the speed of change also created difficulties. Construction schedules were ambitious, and supply chains sometimes struggled to keep pace with demand. Factories occasionally faced shortages of materials or trained personnel. Even so, by the mid-1930s, the Soviet Union had clearly entered a new stage of economic development. A second 5-year plan was introduced with the aim of continuing industrial expansion while improving transportation networks and increasing production of consumer goods. The country was becoming increasingly industrialized, and large engineering projects had begun reshaping both cities and landscapes. At the same time, political life within the Soviet Union was also evolving. The Communist Party remained the central authority guiding national policy. Its leadership structures had grown more centralized during the years of rapid economic planning, and Joseph Stalin's influence within the party had become firmly established. As the 1930s progressed, the Soviet Union would continue developing its industrial base while navigating complex political developments inside the party and the broader society. By the middle of the 1930s, the Soviet Union had undergone a remarkable transformation compared with the country that had emerged from civil war little more than a decade earlier. Industrial centres had expanded, large construction projects had altered regional economies, and new institutions had appeared across education, science, and culture. At the same time, the political structure guiding these developments had become increasingly centralized within the Communist Party. Joseph Stalin now stood as the most influential figure within that leadership structure. His position as General Secretary, combined with years of administrative experience inside the party apparatus, had gradually placed him at the center of political decision-making. Party congresses, central committees, and government institutions continued functioning, but Stalin's authority over appointments and policy direction had become widely recognized. During this period, the Soviet leadership also placed strong emphasis on internal political unity. The revolutionary years had been marked by numerous debates within the Communist Party about strategy, economic policy, and international affairs. By the mid-1930s, the leadership increasingly viewed internal disagreement as a potential risk to political stability. Several developments contributed to this atmosphere of caution. The Soviet Union remained aware of international tensions that were growing across Europe and Asia. Political changes in countries such as Germany, Italy, and Japan suggested that future conflicts might eventually involve multiple major powers. Within this context, Soviet leaders believed the country needed strong internal coordination to manage both economic development and national defense. It was during these years that a series of investigations and political trials took place, involving members of the Communist Party and various state institutions. These events later became known collectively as the Great Purges. The investigations focused on individuals accused of participating in conspiracies against the Soviet state or the leadership of the Communist Party. Some of those accused had previously held prominent positions during the revolutionary period or the early years of the Soviet government. Public trials were held in Moscow, where several former party leaders faced charges related to alleged plots and political opposition. Newspapers reported extensively on the proceedings, and the trials attracted attention both within the Soviet Union and internationally. Alongside these trials, the government also conducted reviews of membership within the Communist Party and administrative institutions. Party committees examined records and activities of officials across the country, removing individuals who were considered unreliable or opposed to the leadership. The security organization responsible for many of these investigations was the NKVD, which had evolved from earlier revolutionary security institutions. Its responsibilities included investigating counter-revolutionary activity and maintaining internal security. During the late 1930s, these investigations expanded significantly. Large numbers of party members, military officers, engineers, administrators, and other professionals were questioned or removed from their positions. The process affected many sectors of Soviet society, including the Red Army. Several senior military commanders who had played important roles during the Civil War were replaced as part of the leadership's effort to restructure the armed forces. For ordinary citizens, the political atmosphere during these years was marked by both rapid modernization and heightened attention to political loyalty. Factories continued producing machinery and industrial equipment, construction projects moved forward, and education programs expanded across the country. At the same time, discussions about political responsibility and vigilance appeared frequently in newspapers, public meetings, and workplace gatherings. Despite the intense political climate, the broader economic transformation of the Soviet Union continued. The second five-year plan expanded many industrial sectors that had begun developing during the earlier program. Coal mines in the Donbass region increased production. Steel factories in the Urals expanded capacity. Hydroelectric stations along major rivers generated electricity for cities and industrial districts. Transportation networks also improved. New rail lines connected remote resource regions with manufacturing centres, allowing raw materials and finished goods to move more efficiently across the country. Education remained a central priority for the government. Universities trained engineers, scientists, and technicians needed for the expanding industrial economy. Schools across the Soviet republics increased literacy rates among younger generations. Scientific research institutions also grew during this period. Soviet scientists worked in fields such as physics, chemistry, aviation engineering, and agriculture. Their work contributed to technological developments that would later become important during the Second World War and the decades that followed. Cultural life developed alongside these economic and scientific changes. The Soviet film industry produced historical dramas, documentaries, and stories about industrial workers and agricultural life. Literature reflected themes of social change, industrial progress, and collective participation in building the new society. Music, theatre, and visual arts also expanded through state-supported institutions that operated in many cities. By the end of the 1930s, the Soviet Union had clearly become one of the largest industrial states in Europe. Heavy industry, transportation networks, and energy production had grown dramatically compared with the country's economic condition immediately after the Civil War. At the same time, the leadership structure of the Soviet state had become firmly centralized around Stalin and the Communist Party. The international situation was also changing rapidly. Across Europe, political tensions continued rising. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, had begun expanding its military forces and altering the balance of power established after the First World War. Diplomatic negotiations among European states attempted to manage these changes, but uncertainty remained high. In 1939, the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, an agreement intended to avoid immediate conflict between the two countries while tensions across Europe intensified. Later that same year, Germany invaded Poland, beginning the conflict that would become the Second World War. For the Soviet Union, the years of industrial expansion during the 1930s would soon prove critical. The factories, railways, and technical institutions developed during the 5-year plans would become central to the country's ability to respond to the enormous challenges that lay ahead. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union would face one of the most devastating military invasions in modern history. In the early hours of the 22nd of June 1941, the political situation that had developed across Europe during the late 1930s suddenly transformed into a direct military threat to the Soviet Union. On that morning, German forces launched a large-scale invasion across the western borders of Soviet territory. The operation, known as Operation Barbarossa, involved millions of soldiers advancing along a front that stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. The invasion represented the largest military operation in modern history. German forces, along with units from Allied countries, moved rapidly through border regions using coordinated air and ground attacks. Their strategy aimed to destroy Soviet military formations quickly and capture major cities before the Soviet government could fully organize a defense. At the time of the invasion, the Soviet Union had been observing developments in Europe with increasing concern. Industrial expansion during the previous decade had strengthened the country's ability to produce military equipment, but the sudden scale and speed of the German advance still presented enormous challenges. In the first weeks of the invasion, German armoured divisions advanced deep into Soviet territory. Several Soviet armies stationed near the frontier were encircled and suffered heavy losses. Communication between units became difficult as front lines shifted rapidly across large areas. Cities and towns in western regions faced immediate danger as military operations unfolded around them. Civilians evacuated when possible, often travelling eastward by rail or road in an effort to move away from the advancing front. Despite these early setbacks, the Soviet government began organising a nationwide response to the invasion. Factories shifted to wartime production, focusing on tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ammunition. Railway networks were used to move troops and equipment toward defensive positions. One of the most remarkable efforts during the early months of the war involved the relocation of industrial facilities. Many factories located in western regions were dismantled and transported eastward to areas beyond the Ural Mountains. There, workers reassembled the machinery and resumed production under difficult conditions. This relocation effort allowed the Soviet Union to continue manufacturing essential equipment even as large territories remained under threat. Meanwhile, the Red Army began reorganizing its defensive strategy. New commanders took charge of military fronts, and fresh units were mobilized from across the country. In the north, German forces moved toward the city of Leningrad. The city, located along the Baltic coast, became the focus of a prolonged siege. German and Finnish forces surrounded Leningrad, cutting many of its supply routes. For nearly 900 days, the city endured extreme hardship while maintaining its defense. Farther south, another major German advance moved toward Ukraine and the industrial regions of the Donbass. The agricultural and industrial resources of these territories made them strategically important. In the center of the front, German armies advanced toward Moscow, the Soviet capital. By the autumn of 1941, the front lines had approached within a relatively short distance of the city. The defense of Moscow became one of the most critical moments of the war. Soviet authorities organized additional defensive lines around the capital. Civilians participated in building fortifications, trenches, and anti-tank barriers in the surrounding countryside. During the winter months of 1941, the Red Army launched a counteroffensive that pushed German forces away from the immediate outskirts of Moscow. Harsh winter conditions affected both armies, slowing operations and forcing adjustments in strategy. Although the German advance had been halted near the capital, the conflict was far from over. Throughout 1942, military operations continued across multiple regions of the Soviet Union. German forces launched new offensives aimed at capturing oil fields in the Caucasus and controlling transportation routes along the Volga River. One of the most significant battles of the war unfolded in the city of Stalingrad, located on the western bank of the Volga. Beginning in the summer of 1942, German and Soviet forces fought intense battles for control of the city. Industrial buildings, residential districts, and river crossings became sites of prolonged combat. The Red Army gradually organized a defensive strategy that slowed the German advance while preparing a larger counteroffensive. In November 1942, Soviet forces launched a coordinated operation that surrounded German units fighting inside Stalingrad. The encircled army remained trapped through the winter months. By early 1943, the German command ordered its remaining forces in the city to surrender. The Battle of Stalingrad marked a major turning point in the war. For the first time since the invasion began, a large German army had been defeated and captured. Following this victory, the Red Army began pushing westward along several fronts. In the summer of 1943, another major confrontation occurred near the city of Kursk. This battle involved some of the largest tank engagements ever recorded. German forces attempted to break Soviet defensive lines, but Soviet commanders had prepared extensive fortifications and reserves. After intense fighting, the German offensive was halted. The Red Army then launched its own operations that pushed the front lines farther west. From this point forward, Soviet forces gradually regained territory that had been occupied earlier in the war. As the Red Army advanced through Ukraine, Belarus, and other regions, cities previously captured by German forces were liberated. The scale of destruction left by years of warfare became increasingly visible. Industrial facilities, railways, bridges, and residential districts required reconstruction. Agricultural land had often been damaged or neglected during military operations. Despite these difficulties, the Soviet war effort continued gaining strength. Factories relocated east of the Urals produced large numbers of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces that supported the advancing armies. By 1944, Soviet forces had pushed beyond the pre-war borders of the Soviet Union and entered Eastern Europe. Military operations continued through Poland, the Baltic region, and the Balkans as German forces retreated westward. The war in Europe approached its final stage in the spring of 1945. Soviet armies advanced toward Berlin, the German capital. After weeks of intense fighting in and around the city, Berlin was captured in May 1945. Shortly afterward, Germany formally surrendered, bringing the European phase of the Second World War to an end. For the Soviet Union, victory came at a tremendous human and material cost. Millions of soldiers and civilians had died during the conflict, and large sections of the country required reconstruction. When the Second World War in Europe ended in May 1945, the Soviet Union stood among the victorious powers, yet the country faced enormous challenges. The conflict had brought destruction across vast regions of the Western Soviet republics. Cities, factories, railways, farms, and homes had been damaged or destroyed during years of fighting. Millions of soldiers and civilians had lost their lives, and many families were beginning the difficult process of rebuilding everyday life. Despite these losses, the Soviet Union had emerged from the war with significant influence in international affairs. The Red Army had advanced across Eastern Europe during the final stages of the conflict, and Soviet military forces remained stationed in several countries that had previously been under German occupation. This situation would soon shape the political landscape of Europe in the years that followed. Immediately after the war, the Soviet government began focusing on reconstruction. Industrial centres that had been damaged during the conflict required repair, and transportation systems needed restoration. Railways were rebuilt, bridges were reconstructed, and factories gradually resumed production. The government introduced new economic plans designed to restore the country's industrial capacity. Heavy industry remained a priority, as it had before the war, because it supported both economic development and national defence. Large industrial projects resumed across the country. Steel plants, machine factories, and mining operations expanded production once again. Workers returned to industrial cities that had been rebuilt or newly constructed during the reconstruction period. Agriculture also required recovery. Farms across the western regions of the Soviet Union had experienced severe disruption during the war years. Fields had been abandoned, livestock populations had declined, and equipment had been lost or damaged. Government programs encouraged the restoration of agricultural production. Collective farms resumed operations and new machinery was distributed to support farming activities. Rural communities gradually rebuilt local infrastructure such as storage facilities, irrigation systems, and village schools. At the same time, the international position of the Soviet Union was changing. During the war, the Soviet Union had cooperated with the United States and Britain in the alliance against Nazi Germany. However, differences in political systems and long-term strategic goals soon became more visible as the immediate wartime cooperation ended. In several countries of Eastern Europe, new governments were formed after the defeat of German occupation forces. Many of these governments developed close political and economic relationships with the Soviet Union. Countries such as Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Czechoslovakia established political systems that were aligned with socialist principles and maintained strong connections with Moscow. These developments created a distinct political region across Eastern Europe, where governments cooperated closely with the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, countries in Western Europe developed political and economic partnerships with the United States and other Western powers. The emerging division between these two regions gradually became known as the Cold War. Unlike earlier global conflicts, the Cold War did not involve direct large-scale fighting between the two major powers. Instead, it was characterized by political competition, military preparedness, and ideological differences between the Soviet Union and the United States along with their respective allies. Both sides invested heavily in scientific research and technological development during this period. One of the most significant areas of competition involved nuclear technology. During the final months of the Second World War, the United States had developed and used atomic weapons. Soviet scientists and engineers worked intensively to develop similar technology. By 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic device. This development marked the beginning of a new phase in international relations, where both major powers possessed extremely powerful weapons. Alongside military developments, the Soviet Union continued pursuing scientific and industrial advancement. Universities expanded programs in physics, engineering, chemistry, and mathematics. Research institutes worked on projects involving aviation, energy production, and electronics. These efforts were supported by a growing network of educational institutions that trained specialists in technical fields. Cultural and educational programs also expanded during the late 1940s and early 1950s. Schools operated across the Soviet republics, and literacy rates among younger generations reached high levels compared with earlier decades. Libraries, theatres, and cultural centres appeared in many cities and towns, offering programs intended to promote participation in literature, music, and the arts. Within the Soviet leadership, Joseph Stalin remained the central political figure throughout the immediate post-war period. His authority had been reinforced by the Soviet Union's role in defeating Germany and by the centralized structure of the Communist Party. Government decisions regarding economic planning, foreign policy, and national security were coordinated through institutions operating under the leadership of the Communist Party. However, by the early 1950s, Stalin was advancing in age, and the leadership of the Soviet Union began preparing for a future transition. In March 1953, Joseph Stalin died after more than 2 decades as the dominant figure in Soviet politics. His death marked the end of a long period in which the Soviet state had been guided by his leadership through industrial transformation, war, and post-war reconstruction. Following his death, several senior members of the Communist Party began working together to manage the government while discussions took place about the future direction of the country. This moment created a new phase in Soviet history. The leadership that followed would attempt to guide the Soviet Union through changes in domestic policy, international relations, and technological development during the next decades of the 20th century. When Joseph Stalin died in March 1953, the Soviet Union entered a period of political adjustment. For many years, the structure of government and party leadership had operated under his dominant authority. After his death, responsibility for directing the state was shared among several senior figures within the Communist Party. Among the most prominent leaders during this transitional period were Georgy Malenkov, Lavrentiy Beria, and Nikita Khrushchev. Each held influential positions within government or party institutions, and together they formed part of a collective leadership that attempted to maintain stability while determining the country's future direction. In the months following Stalin's death, the leadership began reviewing several policies that had been implemented during earlier decades. Discussions focused on improving economic efficiency, easing certain administrative controls, and addressing some of the tensions that had developed within Soviet society. One of the early political developments involved the removal of Lavrentiy Beria from power later in 1953. Other leaders within the party viewed his influence within the security institutions as potentially destabilizing. After a brief internal struggle, Beria was arrested and later removed from political life. Following this event, Nikita Khrushchev gradually emerged as the most prominent figure within the Communist Party. Khrushchev had been active in the party since the revolutionary period and had served in several administrative roles across different regions of the Soviet Union. By the mid-1950s, he held the position of First Secretary of the Communist Party, giving him significant influence over party organization and policy direction. During Khrushchev's leadership, the Soviet government introduced a number of reforms intended to adjust both domestic policy and international relations. One of the most notable moments occurred during the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in 1956. At this meeting, Khrushchev delivered a speech, reviewing aspects of Stalin's leadership and discussing the need for changes in the political climate within the Soviet Union. This speech signaled the beginning of a period often referred to as de-Stalinization. During this time, the government reduced certain political restrictions that had been prominent during earlier decades. Some prisoners who had been held in labour camps were released, and administrative procedures within government institutions were reviewed. At the same time, the Soviet Union continued focusing on economic development and scientific progress. Agriculture became one of Khrushchev's major priorities. The government launched programs intended to increase grain production, including the development of new farmland in regions of Kazakhstan and Siberia. These efforts became known as the Virgin Lands Campaign. Young volunteers traveled to these regions to cultivate large areas of previously uncultivated land. New towns and agricultural centres appeared as part of the program, though the results varied depending on climate conditions and local infrastructure. Industrial growth also continued, particularly in sectors related to energy production, metallurgy, and engineering. The Soviet Union placed increasing emphasis on technological research during the late 1950s. Universities expanded programs in mathematics, physics, and engineering, while scientific institutes conducted research in fields ranging from nuclear energy to rocketry. One of the most visible results of these efforts appeared in 1957. That year, the Soviet Union successfully launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite. The satellite orbited Earth and transmitted radio signals that could be detected by receivers around the world. The launch marked the beginning of the space age and demonstrated the Soviet Union's advanced capabilities in rocket engineering. Shortly afterward, additional achievements followed. In 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to travel into space and orbit the Earth. These developments generated significant international attention and highlighted the scientific achievements of Soviet engineers and researchers. Meanwhile, the Cold War continued shaping global politics. The Soviet Union maintained alliances with socialist countries and supported various political movements around the world that were interested in socialist development. At the same time, relations with Western countries remained cautious, particularly as both sides possessed nuclear weapons capable of enormous destruction. Several moments of tension occurred during this period. One of the most notable was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The crisis developed when the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, a country located close to the United States. American leaders viewed this deployment as a direct security concern. Diplomatic negotiations between the two governments followed, and eventually both sides agreed to remove certain military installations in order to reduce tensions. Although the crisis ended without military conflict, it demonstrated the seriousness of the rivalry between the two superpowers. Inside the Soviet Union, Khrushchev's reforms and policies produced mixed reactions within the Communist Party. Some leaders supported his efforts to adjust agricultural policy and encourage scientific development. Others believed that certain reforms were introduced too quickly or required further planning. By 1964, several senior members of the party leadership concluded that new direction was necessary. Khrushchev was removed from his position, and a new leadership group assumed responsibility for guiding the country. Among the figures who emerged from this transition was Leonid Brezhnev, who would become the next long-term leader of the Soviet Union. The decades that followed would bring a period characterized by stability in political leadership, continued industrial development, and ongoing participation in the global rivalry that defined the Cold War. After Nikita Khrushchev was removed from leadership in 1964, the Soviet Union entered a period in which political authority once again became more stable and collective within the upper levels of the Communist Party. The leadership structure that followed was designed to avoid concentrating power too heavily in a single individual, and several senior officials shared responsibility for directing government policy. Leonid Brezhnev soon emerged as the central figure in this arrangement. Serving as General Secretary of the Communist Party, Brezhnev oversaw the political administration of the Soviet system while working alongside other officials who managed government ministries, economic planning agencies, and international diplomacy. The leadership emphasized continuity and predictability after the rapid policy shifts that had occurred during the previous decade. For many citizens, daily life during the later 1960s and early 1970s became more stable compared with earlier periods of dramatic change. Economic planning continued to operate through 5-year plans that guided industrial production and infrastructure development. Large factories produced machinery, vehicles, and industrial equipment used across the Soviet republics. Energy production expanded through the development of oil fields in Siberia and natural gas reserves in other regions. These energy resources gradually became an important part of the Soviet economy, supplying both domestic industry and export markets. Urban development also continued during these years. Many cities constructed large residential districts made up of apartment buildings designed to house growing urban populations. These housing projects often included schools, shops, and public transportation routes that connected residential areas with industrial workplaces. For many families, moving into a new apartment represented an improvement compared with earlier housing conditions that had involved shared communal living arrangements. Education remained a major focus of government policy. Schools across the Soviet Union provided universal basic education, and universities trained specialists in engineering, science, medicine, and other professions needed in a modern industrial society. The number of engineers and technical specialists increased steadily during these decades as industrial systems became more complex and technologically advanced. Scientific research also continued expanding. Soviet scientists worked in fields such as nuclear physics, chemistry, computing, and space exploration. The space program remained an important symbol of technological capability, and missions continued to send satellites and spacecraft into orbit. At the same time, the Cold War continued shaping international relations. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, both the Soviet Union and the United States began exploring ways to reduce the risk of direct confrontation. Diplomatic negotiations focused on arms control agreements intended to limit certain categories of nuclear weapons. These discussions produced agreements such as the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, often referred to as SALT. The negotiations aimed to establish frameworks for managing the balance of nuclear forces between the two countries. This period of cautious diplomatic engagement was sometimes described as détente, reflecting a temporary easing of tensions in international relations. Despite these diplomatic efforts, the rivalry between the two superpowers remained present. Both countries continued maintaining large military forces and alliances across different regions of the world. The Soviet Union maintained close relationships with socialist governments in Eastern Europe through an alliance system known as the Warsaw Pact. This military organization connected the Soviet Union with several allied states and coordinated defense policies among them. Meanwhile, Western European countries and the United States were linked through the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. Within the Soviet Union itself, the leadership during the Brezhnev years emphasized stability in political administration. Major policy changes occurred gradually, and long-term planning became an important feature of economic management. Industrial production remained strong in sectors such as steel, machinery, chemicals, and energy. Transportation networks expanded as new railways and pipelines connected distant regions with urban markets. However, by the mid-1970s, some economists and planners began noticing that the pace of economic growth was slowing compared with the earlier decades of rapid industrial expansion. Factories continued producing large quantities of goods, but efficiency sometimes declined due to aging equipment, complex administrative procedures, and difficulties in coordinating large planning systems across a vast country. Agriculture also presented ongoing challenges. Although collective and state farms produced significant amounts of grain and other crops, harvests varied depending on weather conditions and logistical factors. To address these issues, the government occasionally imported grain from international markets in order to maintain stable food supplies. Despite these economic concerns, everyday life for many Soviet citizens during the 1970s remained relatively predictable. People worked in factories, offices, schools, hospitals, and research institutes. Public transportation carried commuters across large cities each day. Cultural activities continued through theatres, cinemas, and libraries that served communities across the Soviet republics. Television became increasingly common in households, providing news broadcasts, educational programs, and entertainment. Sports also played an important role in public life. Soviet athletes participated in international competitions, including the Olympic Games, where they often achieved strong results in a variety of sports. By the end of the 1970s, the Soviet Union remained one of the world's two major superpowers. Its industrial capacity, scientific institutions, and military forces placed it at the center of global politics. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union remained one of the most influential countries in the world. Its territory stretched across Eurasia, its population numbered in the hundreds of millions, and its industrial system supported a wide range of scientific and technological programs. At the same time, its role in global politics continued to be shaped by the ongoing rivalry known as the Cold War. During these years, the Soviet Union maintained alliances with several countries that had adopted socialist political systems after the Second World War. These alliances extended across Eastern Europe and also reached into parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, where governments had developed cooperative relationships with Moscow. International diplomacy, therefore, became a complex balance of cooperation and competition. While periods of negotiation occasionally reduced tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States, disagreements continued regarding political influence, military presence, and ideological differences. One major area of competition involved technological development. Both superpowers invested heavily in scientific research, particularly in fields connected to defense, communications, and space exploration. The Soviet Union continued launching satellites and conducting space missions through its well-established space program. During the 1970s, Soviet spacecraft carried out missions that explored the Moon and Venus, while long-duration space stations allowed cosmonauts to remain in orbit for extended periods. These projects required advanced engineering, coordination between research institutes, and the participation of thousands of scientists and technicians. Scientific institutions across the Soviet Union expanded during this period. Universities trained specialists in physics, mathematics, computer science, and engineering. Research centers worked on projects involving electronics, aviation technology, and nuclear energy. Industrial development also continued in several sectors. Oil and natural gas production expanded significantly, especially in Siberia. Pipelines were constructed to transport energy resources across long distances, supplying both domestic industry and international markets. These energy exports became an important source of economic strength for the Soviet Union. At the same time, the leadership in Moscow continued guiding the country through centralized economic planning. 5-year plans still served as the primary method for organizing production targets and infrastructure projects. Factories produced machinery, vehicles, and industrial equipment used across the Soviet republics. Mining operations extracted coal, metals, and other raw materials needed to sustain industrial output. Despite these achievements, certain structural challenges within the economy became increasingly visible. Large planning systems sometimes struggled to respond quickly to local conditions. Factories occasionally produced goods that did not perfectly match consumer demand. Transportation delays or administrative procedures sometimes slowed the distribution of products between regions. These difficulties did not prevent the Soviet economy from functioning, but they gradually affected efficiency in certain sectors. Meanwhile, the international political environment remained active. One of the most significant developments occurred in 1979 when the Soviet Union became involved in Afghanistan. The Afghan government had experienced internal political instability, and Soviet leaders agreed to provide military assistance in support of the existing government. Soviet forces entered Afghanistan with the intention of stabilizing the situation. However, the conflict developed into a prolonged military engagement involving local resistance groups and international attention. The Afghan war required significant military resources and became one of the most challenging foreign policy situations the Soviet Union faced during the late Cold War. Back in the Soviet Union, daily life for citizens continued within the familiar rhythms of work, education, and community life. Large apartment districts housed millions of families in cities such as Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and many regional centers. Public transportation systems carried workers to factories and offices each day. Schools provided universal education, and universities continued preparing specialists for careers in science, medicine, engineering, and administration. Cultural life also remained active. Soviet films, literature, music, and theatre productions reached audiences across the country. Libraries and cultural centres hosted events that encouraged participation in reading, arts, and discussion. Sports programs remained popular as well. Soviet athletes continued competing internationally, representing the country in Olympic competitions and other global tournaments. During the early 1980s, however, the leadership of the Soviet Union began experiencing transitions. Leonid Brezhnev, who had served as General Secretary for nearly 2 decades, died in 1982. His long period of leadership had brought stability to the political system, but his passing opened the way for new figures to assume responsibility for guiding the country. Yuri Andropov succeeded Brezhnev as General Secretary. Before assuming this role, Andropov had served for many years in the state security institutions and later within the Communist Party leadership. During his time in office, Andropov introduced efforts to improve economic discipline and administrative efficiency. He encouraged campaigns aimed at reducing workplace absenteeism and strengthening organizational management within factories and government offices. However, his leadership period was relatively brief. Andropov died in 1984 after a period of illness. Following his death, Konstantin Chernenko became the next General Secretary. Chernenko had long experience within the Communist Party administration but faced health difficulties during his tenure. As a result, the leadership during these years continued operating largely through established institutions rather than through major new reforms. By the mid-1980s, it had become clear to many within the Soviet leadership that the country would soon need a younger generation of political figures capable of addressing the economic and administrative challenges that had gradually developed. In 1985, a new leader would emerge whose policies would begin reshaping the Soviet Union in ways that few observers could fully anticipate. In March 1985, the leadership of the Soviet Union passed to a new figure who represented a younger generation within the Communist Party. Mikhail Gorbachev, who had been active in regional and national party administration for many years, was elected General Secretary following the death of Konstantin Chernenko. At the time of his appointment, Gorbachev was noticeably younger than many of the leaders who had guided the Soviet Union during the previous decades. His rise to the position reflected a growing recognition within the party that the country faced economic and administrative challenges requiring renewed attention. The Soviet Union remained a powerful industrial state, with extensive scientific institutions, a large military, and strong influence across Eastern Europe. Yet the leadership increasingly understood that economic growth had slowed compared with earlier decades of rapid expansion. Factories continued producing large quantities of industrial goods, but many relied on equipment installed years earlier. Agricultural production remained stable in many regions, though harvests still varied depending on climate conditions and logistical factors. The centralized planning system that had supported decades of development sometimes struggled to adapt quickly to changing needs. Production targets established years in advance could be difficult to adjust when local circumstances changed. Gorbachev and several other leaders concluded that reforms would be necessary in order to improve economic performance and administrative efficiency. Two concepts soon became central to his approach: perestroika and glasnost. Perestroika, a Russian word meaning restructuring, referred to a series of economic and administrative reforms intended to modernize the Soviet system. The goal was not to abandon the socialist framework, but to adjust how planning, management, and production were organized. Some enterprises were given greater flexibility in how they operated, allowing factory managers to respond more directly to local conditions. Cooperative businesses were also permitted in certain sectors, enabling groups of workers to establish small enterprises providing services and consumer goods. Glasnost, meaning openness, referred to efforts to increase transparency within government and public life. Newspapers and magazines began publishing more detailed discussions about economic conditions, social issues, and historical topics that had previously received limited public attention. Television programs and public forums also expanded discussions about the country's future direction. These changes created a noticeable shift in the atmosphere of public conversation. Writers, journalists, and historians began examining aspects of Soviet history with greater openness. Citizens participated in meetings and discussions about economic reform, environmental issues, and social policy. At the same time, the Soviet Union continued participating in international diplomacy. One of Gorbachev's major priorities involved reducing tensions with Western countries. Meetings between Soviet and American leaders focused on arms reduction agreements intended to limit nuclear weapons. These discussions eventually produced the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987, which eliminated certain categories of nuclear missiles from both sides. International relations during these years gradually became less confrontational than during earlier phases of the Cold War. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union also reassessed its involvement in Afghanistan. The conflict had continued throughout the 1980s and required significant military resources. In 1988, the Soviet government began withdrawing its forces from Afghanistan, completing the withdrawal the following year. Inside the Soviet Union, the reforms associated with perestroika and glasnost produced complex and sometimes unexpected results. The increased openness of public discussion allowed citizens to express concerns about economic performance, environmental problems, and administrative inefficiencies. Newspapers published investigative reports examining issues that had previously received limited attention. Regional identities within the Soviet republics also became more visible during this period. Cultural organizations and public groups began discussing local history, language preservation, and economic development within individual republics. In some regions, these discussions gradually developed into broader political movements seeking greater autonomy within the Union. At the same time, economic reforms encountered practical difficulties. Adjusting the planning system while maintaining stable production required careful coordination, and changes often moved more slowly than expected. Factories and government agencies sometimes faced uncertainty about how new policies should be implemented. Supply networks that had operated under earlier planning structures occasionally experienced disruptions during the transition. Despite these challenges, the reform period continued through the late 1980s. Political institutions also began evolving. In 1989, elections were held for a new legislative body known as the Congress of People's Deputies. These elections introduced competitive elements into Soviet political life, allowing voters to choose among several candidates in many districts. Televised sessions of the Congress allowed citizens to observe debates among political representatives, further increasing public engagement with national policy discussions. By the end of the decade, the Soviet Union had entered a period of significant political transformation. The reforms initiated by Gorbachev had opened new possibilities for public participation and institutional change. At the same time, the adjustments to economic management and political structure created uncertainties that would soon shape the final stage of the Soviet Union's history. By the end of the 1980s, the Soviet Union had entered a period of profound political and social change. The reforms introduced during the years of perestroika and glasnost had opened public discussion in ways that had not been common in earlier decades. Citizens across the Soviet republics were reading newspapers that discussed economic policy, historical events, and political ideas with greater openness than before. The new Congress of People's Deputies, first elected in 1989, became an important stage for these discussions. Its sessions were broadcast on television, allowing viewers across the country to watch debates between representatives with differing views about the direction of the Soviet state. Some deputies supported continuing reforms within the existing structure of the Soviet Union. Others argued that deeper political changes were necessary in order to address economic challenges and provide greater authority to regional governments. These debates reflected the complexity of the Soviet Union itself. The country was composed of 15 republics, each with its own history, language traditions, and regional institutions. For many years, the central government in Moscow had coordinated political and economic planning across all of these territories. During the reform period, however, several republics began discussing the possibility of increasing their autonomy within the Union. Local political organizations appeared in some regions, advocating greater control over economic policy, cultural affairs, and administrative decisions. These discussions varied widely in tone and objective depending on the local circumstances of each republic. In the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, public movements organized large gatherings supporting expanded independence from the Soviet Union. Cultural festivals, historical commemorations, and peaceful demonstrations became common during these years as citizens discussed their political future. Similar conversations appeared in other republics as well, though often with different goals. In some regions, the focus remained on negotiating a revised federal structure that would give republic governments greater authority while preserving the overall union. Meanwhile, economic conditions across the Soviet Union remained difficult. Industrial production continued, but supply systems that had once been coordinated through centralized planning were undergoing adjustments during the reform process. Factories sometimes experienced shortages of materials or delays in transportation. Shops occasionally faced limited inventories of consumer goods, as distribution networks struggled to adapt to new economic policies. Government leaders attempted to address these issues through additional reforms, but the scale of the Soviet economy made rapid changes difficult to coordinate. During this same period, political life continued evolving. In 1990, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union ended its constitutional status as the sole governing party. This change allowed the creation of additional political organizations and increased pluralism within the political system. New political groups began forming across the country, representing a wide range of perspectives about economic reform, political structure, and the relationship between the republics and the central government. The Soviet Union was now moving through a transformation that few observers had anticipated only a decade earlier. In 1991, efforts were underway to negotiate a new Union treaty that would redefine the relationship between Moscow and the republic governments. The proposed agreement aimed to preserve a looser federation in which republics would hold greater autonomy while maintaining shared institutions for defense and foreign policy. However, not all political figures supported this direction. In August 1991, a group of senior officials within the Soviet government attempted to halt the reform process by temporarily assuming control of the government while President Mikhail Gorbachev was away from Moscow. The event became known as the August coup attempt. The group announced that it intended to restore order and prevent what it believed to be the disintegration of the Soviet state. Tanks and military units appeared in parts of Moscow as the announcement was broadcast. Yet the situation developed quickly in an unexpected direction. Large numbers of citizens gathered in Moscow and other cities to express opposition to the attempt. Political leaders within the Russian Republic government, including Boris Yeltsin, called for resistance to the takeover. Within a few days, the attempted coup lost support among military units and government institutions. The officials who had organized the effort were removed from power, and the reform process resumed. However, the political consequences of the event were significant. In the months that followed, several republics accelerated their discussions about independence. Governments in the Baltic states declared full independence, and other republics began considering similar steps. Negotiations about the future of the Soviet Union continued through the autumn of 1991, but it became increasingly clear that maintaining the previous structure of the Union would be difficult. By December of that year, leaders from several republics agreed that the Soviet Union would formally dissolve and be replaced by a new association of independent states. During the final weeks of 1991, the long political transformation that had been unfolding across the Soviet Union reached its conclusion. For several months, republic governments had been discussing how their relationship with the central authorities in Moscow might change. Some hoped to maintain a loose federation, while others believed full independence would allow them to manage their political and economic affairs more directly. Events moved quickly during this final period. After the unsuccessful coup attempt in August 1991, the authority of the Central Soviet government weakened considerably. Many republics began taking steps to assume greater control over their own political institutions, economic systems, and public administration. Parliaments in several republics passed declarations affirming their sovereignty. Governments began preparing for the transition to independent statehood, while continuing discussions about how cooperation between the former republics might continue in areas such as trade, transportation, and diplomacy. Throughout the autumn, leaders from different republics met to discuss possible arrangements for a new political structure. The goal was to avoid sudden disruption while acknowledging the reality that the Soviet Union's previous centralized system could no longer operate in the same way. In early December 1991, leaders from three of the republics, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, met in the Belovezha forest region near the border between Belarus and Poland. During these discussions, they agreed that the Soviet Union had effectively ceased functioning as a unified state. They proposed the creation of a new organization known as the Commonwealth of Independent States. This association would allow the former republics to cooperate in certain areas while recognizing each member as a sovereign country. Shortly afterward, additional republics announced their participation in the new arrangement. These agreements confirmed that the Soviet Union, which had existed since 1922, would formally dissolve. On the 25th of December 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev announced that he was resigning from his position as President of the Soviet Union. In a televised address, he reflected on the years of reform that had attempted to modernize the country and reduce tensions in international relations. Later that evening, the flag of the Soviet Union was lowered above the Kremlin in Moscow and replaced with the flag of the Russian Federation. With that moment, the political structure known as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics officially came to an end. The dissolution of the Soviet Union marked the close of one of the most influential chapters in 20th century history. For nearly 70 years, the Soviet state had played a central role in global affairs. It had emerged from the upheaval of revolution and civil war, transformed a largely agrarian society into a major industrial power, and participated in some of the defining events of the modern era. Its industrial expansion during the early decades reshaped the economic landscape of Eurasia. Its role in the Second World War had contributed decisively to the defeat of Nazi Germany. Its scientific institutions had helped open the era of space exploration, sending the first satellite and the first human into orbit. At the same time, the Soviet Union had also experienced periods of intense political control, economic experimentation, and social transformation that shaped the lives of generations of citizens across its republics. When the Union dissolved in 1991, 15 independent countries emerged from its former territory. Each of these states began developing its own political institutions and economic systems while maintaining varying degrees of cooperation with its neighbours. The end of the Soviet Union also transformed the international balance of power. The Cold War rivalry that had defined global politics for decades gradually came to a close, opening a new period in international relations. Yet the legacy of the Soviet Union remained visible in many ways. Cities built during the era of industrial expansion continued operating as major economic centres. Scientific institutions and universities trained new generations of researchers and engineers. Cultural traditions developed during the Soviet decades remained part of everyday life in many communities. Across the former Soviet republics, historical memory preserved the experiences of revolution, war, reconstruction, and technological achievement that had defined much of the 20th century. Understanding the story of the Soviet Union means recognizing how a vast empire transformed through revolution into a new political system, how that system shaped global events for decades, and how its eventual dissolution opened a new chapter for the countries that had once formed its union. And now, as our journey through this long and complex history comes to a gentle close, it may be a good moment to slow the pace of the evening. Imagine the quiet of a late night in a wide northern landscape. Cities are settling into stillness. Trains move slowly across distant rail lines. Lights glow softly in apartment windows as families rest after the routines of the day. History often moves through moments of great change, yet the everyday lives of people continue within those larger stories. The Soviet Union existed through decades of transformation, through revolution, reconstruction, global rivalry, and technological discovery. And across those decades, millions of ordinary people lived their lives, raised families, worked in factories and farms, studied in schools and universities, and contributed to the development of their communities. Now the long arc of that history rests quietly in the past. So wherever you may be listening tonight, allow the mind to drift calmly through the landscapes of history we've explored together. The lights in distant cities grow dimmer, the sound of the fan hums softly in the background, and the story settles into stillness.